Welcome back, everyone, to our final panel discussion of Fear of Missing Out. This afternoon's panel is chaired by Hito Steyerl and co-chaired on my immediate left by Nina Power. We're joined by McKenzie, Wark, and Yuri, Pattison, who presented this morning, and by Helen Hester, whose presentation you've just seen. After we've spoken for about 45 minutes, there'll be an opportunity for questions and comments. Great, thank you.
Well, thanks a lot, Stephen, for the introductions. Thanks to Nina for agreeing to co-chairing this panel with me, and thanks to everyone for coming back. As in the past 3 days, I think probably the only way of trying to find common ground between the different presentations is by way of slightly irrational jump cuts. So I'll try to do this again. But then really also trying to open up perspectives into the future after trying to summarize some of the aspects of this conference. So actually I was reminded today of the first day of the conference, in which we had a very interesting periodization of the web, starting with Peter Sunder's presentation about Pirate Bay and peer-to-peer file sharing, and an era of the web which is irrevocably over, which was followed by a presentation by Mediengruppe Bitnik, in which, again, different stages of the web emerged, in which, you know, on the one hand, you sent off stuff to people they never had asked for, and then on the other hand, you also were sent lots of stuff you never asked for. So there emerged very distinct stages in the development of the web within the past, I don't know, maybe 2 decades, which I think also play into my understanding of Helen's presentation, because I think that most of the examples you presented were from a period, let's say, between 2004 and 2007, when the web or circulation of images on the web was still of a slightly less restricted and sanitized nature. And to try to tie this to Yuri's presentation, since then a very, in my view, essentially extremely funny phenomenon has emerged. It's not only funny, it's also very tragic. The attempt to sanitize the corporate web of unwanted, mainly pornographic imagery by trying to outsource this task to algorithm, a task which leads to never-ending amusement because it always fails in such funny ways. But so there have been many attempts to find algorithm to define pornography, which always fail, even though there is very long formulas to try to quantify pornographic images in relation to others, which invariably end up with images of babies being marked as pornographic and so on and so on. So there's a very interesting history to that, but in a way it harks back to Yuri's presentation again, because again, in main task of image recognition still ends up with humans, because they are the only one able to do it. And it is a task basically censoring the web or getting rid of unwanted and also terribly horrific, gory, violent representations that is mainly outsourced nowadays to countries like the Philippines is a very, very popular destination for this kind of labor. India, Mexico, it's also the task that is widely outsourced through this kind of, not necessarily Amazon, but similar platforms, so it ends up being globally distributed and extremely underpaid labor. So the people that are basically trying to get rid of these representations earn around $1 to $4 per hour doing that. There's another story which I wrote about in one of my texts. I apologize to the people who know it, but which also condenses other aspects of the things that were discussed not only today but also yesterday, namely the example of bot militias. And I found this extremely funny bot which was a member of a Turkish bot militia, bot armies. And you know that bot armies are like these very, let's say, minor artificial intelligences thrown into the realm of social media to support or undermine other parties' political messages. And they are being used very often in Turkey, Russia, Syria, Mexico is another location where bot armies are extremely popular. And I found a bot in a Turkish, in an AKP, one has to emphasize bot army. AKP is the governing party in Turkey, Recep Tayyip Erdogan's party, which I immediately fell in love with because he was so fantastic. So he was pushing the AKP message as essentially, in a very absurd twist, as a bot on Twitter trying to justify Erdogan's ban of Twitter. That was his plan, you know, he was out to justify on Twitter why Twitter was not working, shouldn't be working. But the interesting thing that someone found out, of course by way of Google image recognition, that someone had actually stolen a picture of a webcam worker, a gay sex worker who works on webcams online. That's how he makes his living. He sells a lot of different things and so on. And they had basically stolen his picture and used it for the bot. And I was absolutely fascinated, you know, by the labor that this bot embodied. You know, the labor in very different areas of the web and in many different directions. Yeah, but the question, there's another aspect that reminded me of a discussion we had yesterday, a discussion about animation. And then that again ties back to Helen's talk, because it seems to me, I mean, I'm not an expert, but it seems to me that animation is also a really big thing in porn now. That basically all these realistic genres of porn are being more and more replaced by 3D porn. And I really find it extremely interesting that the main genre within 3D porn, in my view, I don't know if it's true or not, I mean, it seems to me like it's fantasy monster porn, right? So it doesn't have anything to do with anything realistic, but it's like this almost Nordic elf LARP fantasy kind of porn. And essentially, the really interesting thing is that it is, in fact, interspecies porn, right? And I have always wondered who is going to be the new species that is going to emerge from this kind of, you know, interaction, reproduction. Is this the new species? And now I want to tie it back to Ken's talk. Is this the new species that is going to populate, no? The new world that is hopefully going to emerge now in the 21st century.
Sex, that's how it's going to start.
You know,
that's one of the genres,
that.
Right?
We should write a book, next book together about
title,
animation. Okay, but this brings me to my real question, and I think, you know, a conference that started out focusing on digital anxieties, no, and on the very real misery that the contemporary digital condition also entails. I think at the end it should really try to focus on where to take this anxiety, you know, and how to move forward into a 21st century that would actually be different than its predecessor. Yeah, I know, I mean, these are all huge questions, but when we talked briefly before the panel, Nina and I thought we would really try to push this kind of question. What is this new world, no, that is hopefully going to emerge from all this? And is this fear of missing out, is it essentially the fear of missing out on the creation of the new world, right?
Okay, I'll just follow up on that on the basis of what we were just saying. Yeah, I mean, I think to go back to this question of the fear of missing out, and to try to unpick it and maybe try to think about what a sort of militant anxiety might look like, or a repurposing of anxiety And I keep thinking of that phrase, may you live in interesting times. We could say, may you live in anxious times, as a paradigmatic insult of our age. And I think this notion of the fear of missing out, which itself is maybe now a slightly dated phrase in internet time, the time of the internet, which is always running anxiously. It's an anxiety, of course, about enjoyment, but there's also, of course, the enjoyment of giving up on enjoyment. What does it mean to say yes to go to something, but actually just stay at home? And I'm kind of interested in this like perverse position, which is maybe a kind of refusal of desire, which is of course like apt to go terribly, terribly wrong, because the inhibition and repression will always kind of explode somewhere else. And I worry then about if anxiety isn't foregrounded, what happens, I suppose, to all of that anxiety? What does it become? Does it become introversion? Does it become, self-exclusion as a way of warding off a general social exclusion or social death? And so I think linking up anxiety to sociability in the name of a sort of militant anxiety points to a kind of inadequacy of contemporary forms of collectivity, right? The social media and the sort of internet sociability is clearly generating more anxiety perhaps than it is generating joy, let's say. But there's also a kind of inadequacy of individuality, and I think that goes back to something that Ken was saying about capacity. We don't yet know what it's like to be individuals, let alone to be collectives, right? We're absolutely channeled into very narrow routes. It's about the division of labour. We even in precarious or poly-workerish situations, our capacities are like very channeled. We don't yet know what it is to be an individual, let alone a collective. And so I'm always quite interested in what it means to start from negative collective affects, right? What does it mean to be the individual bearers of collective affects that flow through you? And that we should not repress, that we should not talk about, if you see what I mean. Yeah.
Yeah, the fear of missing out is also the fear of missing out on the collective, right?
Yeah.
The fear of not fearing things in common.
Well, I kind of wish I brought a notebook up here now, since there were so many really rich points that were coming out of that. Thank you. One thing that I was thinking about in terms of your conversation was about this idea of it was making me think about cyberfeminism in particular. So this idea about the web becoming increasingly commodified and it becoming less of a space of opportunity around images. So this idea of a closing down. It's there in a lot of discussions of why cyberfeminism sort of fizzled out in the 90s, is that cyberfeminism was tending to be assuming that there were these great opportunities inherent within networked computing technologies, but this was a very non-visual space at that time. So they were talking about sort of MUDs, they were talking about message boards, they were talking about like chat. And so they were talking about something that was very textual rather than sort of visual in the way that it is now, where we've got sort of this new emphasis upon sort of Flickr and webcams, and it's gone very much from being a space where the cyberfeminists problematically imagined that you could be disembodied, and of course there's been a lot of critique of that from sort of a race and able-bodiedness perspective, but they were imagining, okay, well, we can transcend ourselves to this new thing where there's the actual body is being put into the web in more and more ways, through the ways that we are kind of photographing ourselves and sharing images of ourselves, and the expectation that we'll be filmed for everything that we talk at, and then that will be put up on YouTube, and in this real sort of emphasis and return upon embodiment. And sort of the cyberfeminism thing was sort of floating through my head as well when you were talking about interspecies sex, because it was Sadie Plant, when she was imagining her future, she was talking a little bit about porn, and she was apparently well into the monster stuff, and she said that she would be really interested to find a bacterial pornography, like a non-human and inhuman pornography that like transcends the human body and goes to something completely different and completely reimagined. That doesn't seem like much of a basis for kind of a new radical politics like bacteria sex, but...
Why not? I mean, that could work.
I'm not quite sure how you could leverage it for like opening a new future through red hot XXX bacteria action.
There's been, after cyberfeminism was like the whole cam girl movement, for example, which was like ambiguously feminist or political. It was all sorts of other things as well. And now there's xenofeminism, which sort of takes on the other embodied side of it in a way. So I actually think that was a kind of important moment that's got recapitulated into these other things that might then address some things that cyberfeminism couldn't get to. In the age of Olia Liana was asking what speed all this was happening at the time, and I nearly put my hand up to say 1200 baud, sort of thinking maybe it was 2400 baud, so dial-up essentially. So yeah, it was not a visual landscape at the time.
Yeah, that's why I'm, I guess, interested in these text chats as artifacts as well, because they strip it down to the basic level of communication. Particularly what I learned from the Soviet coup exchanges is that you did have people being honest about their identity within those, but it was towards a different cause. And I think that in some ways Facebook, the conservative nature of Facebook, has leveraged this sort of expectation of a very conservative online identity that has knock-on effects on the rest of the internet. And I guess that assertion of having to use your real name causes problems elsewhere. And it's kind of like your activities can be linked to this Facebook account, or that you have to have a Facebook account, or it's expected to have that online presence, I guess compromises your ability to use that space freely in other areas. So maybe it's like a case of reformatting our engagement in some way.
Yeah, because you get all that stuff about sort of people, when you're applying for a job, they check your Facebook page and, this sense of having to assemble an identity there that is palatable to the widest range of audiences possible, because you never know who's going to check it out. But I mean, I guess as well, kind of to return to this idea of a future and to think, okay, well, and a technologically mediated and more emancipatory future. The idea that we're focusing a lot on networked computing technologies when we're talking about these new technological way forwards. And I actually think, this is a point that Judy made in her talk on Friday, was that we are existing with a lot of older forms of technology all the time as well. So when we're thinking about not necessarily a cyber-feminist approach, but a techno-feminist approach, we need to be thinking about reproductive technologies, how we can put women's health in women's hands. We need to be thinking about the real failure to think about the domestic technologies beyond a certain point. It's kind of stalled the development of labour-saving technologies. And I was talking to you earlier about washing machines and whether they were actually labour-saving at all, given that there was this new individualisation and privatisation of certain kinds of social reproductive work that happened with those technologies. And so, I think whenever we're trying to talk about, how to use technologies to build a better kind of future, which sounds like such a naive idea, but we need to be thinking about everything that's out there, not just getting funneled down into Facebook and the internet and Twitter and how we can use those, but thinking about these other really material technologies around us and how we can be sort of techno-materialist in our politics. I just thought
Bacterial sex actually exists. It's Botox. Yeah, that's what it is. It's like, thank you. Yeah, I figured out what that is now. It's like,
so it didn't really work out that well.
Well, depends on your point of view. You won't have an expression on your face ever again. But you got high with the bacteria. Yeah, clearly. And there was a sort of once upon a time a kind of fetishizing of internet as one technical layer. But yeah, one would have to think whole systems in the 21st century and how deep the infrastructure got. How much energy it consumes, how much it's also pharmacological, for example, that we're all pharmacological, technical bodies and so on. It does sort of really, I think, finally undermine those more romantic ideas that we go back to some natural state. And it's like, we're humans, we've never had a natural state. It's part of our species being that, it's not that your hand can pick up a tool, it's that picking up tools has shaped the hand. over the course of a million years. Like, this is who we are.
Yeah, and then I guess that plays into a lot of discussions that go on around alienation and the idea of sort of technology being an alienating force in terms of work, and the idea that, well, as we were kind of increasingly doing these smaller and smaller bits of a task instead of a holistic whole task, we became sort of estranged from our labour. And obviously there's a lot to be said for that argument, but I think it's Amy Wendling, I think, makes the point that, well, you know, having this kind of lament about how you've been alienated from labour is only possible if you ignore some of the facts that women were excluded from being able to do any of this labour before it was technologised. You know, so something like the guild structure, for example, would exclude women from participating in terms of these lovely holistic forms of work that were supposedly so prelapsarian. But we all kind of, if we stop and think about it, know that we're basically shit, but just a different kind of shit. And so, you know, I think we need to think about the way that that suggests that there are opportunities for kind of shaking old forms of limitation and repression, but at the cost of new forms, and trying to kind of see how we can think our way out of that, you know, to think towards post-work and towards post-capitalism. And I mean, and as you point out, when we talk about there are various forms of work that we need to be post, and really important in that is not overlooking social reproduction and care work, which so often is never formulated as a form of work at all and just becomes invisible.
Well, not to mention work that neither produces nor reproduces, which would be like the queer critique of essentialising like both those things together. So you've at least got three categories to try to think as kinds of action in the world that humans do.
Any thoughts? Yes, there's a question back there.
Hi. I just was wondering, the point that you guys were making before about the disembodiment of the internet and how that led to, you know, this cyber feminism kind of deteriorating in the 90s. I'm having all of these thoughts and kind of putting them together. So Peter Soon was, you know, talking earlier about how, you know, these new vectoralist entities are coming up, like Facebook, Google, all of these very large monopolies who are now owning all of this information. And it's almost easier for governments to be able to censor and control and own that kind of information if they're through entities like that everyone has access to and everyone uses extremely frequently. And so I'm wondering what your thoughts are on this idea that perhaps it's the government or, you know, whoever is censoring us, or like the surveillance aspects, they almost want us to become more embodied in these kinds of, you know, owned information organizations, because it's almost like this naturally selective thing where it's easier to censor you and surveillance you if you're a person and an embodied idea. But like, you know, this is pre-digital where, you know, the natural selection and the capitalistic organization was more like, we can surveillance you and censor you if you're part of this embodied group of collective people. But now, post-digital, we have all of this information, and the more we become embodied in this system, the more we become natural in this, or have a sense of self, or have a body in our Facebook page, etc., if that's almost an easier way for them to censor us, like a new natural selection through disinformation. Sorry if that didn't make a lot of sense, but...
Yeah, that's what became clear, I think, over the last 20 years. And it's the devil's bargain of Facebook saying, look, be any gender you want, and if you don't like these 20, make up your own. But you are then identified by whatever you chose, yeah? So it's like another data point that, in fact, more specifically registers, you know, some cluster of information that's resonant with a particular body somewhere. And that period, I mean, call it what you like, over the last 20 years is about finding ways that information becomes a specific kind of power that can then organise both bodies and things on a planetary scale. And that's why I say maybe it's not capitalism anymore, it's something else. And so maybe it's not a capitalist class. I called it a vectoralist class in the sense of control of the means by which information is gathered, circulated, and transmitted, then becomes the means by which you're controlling a physical economy by having made one thing separate from the other. So that might be where we are, and it might caution just a little, just to be a little discreet about what information is where about oneself, because trying to intentionally be invisible will just draw more attention to you anyway. But to just be a little discreet about forms of visibility might be the least kind of hygiene one can practice.
Yeah, there seems to be some kind of, what was sort of bubbling up in my head when you were talking there was sort of ideas about the Foucauldian confession as being this kind of, this then point for the exercise of power and this demand that we are continually speaking about ourselves and so on. But I think you need to kind of factor in as well the role of stuff like metadata. It's not just that we are there and we are articulating ourselves and that sets us up as being something that can be surveilled, but just the very act of kind of using these technological infrastructures means that we can be surveilled in ways that almost are too complex for us to register. Because we think about, okay, well, I've got to be careful about what I put on my Facebook, but maybe we don't think about, okay, well, actually, where are we going? What am I doing? How is information being gathered about me all the time? And I think there is growing kind of awareness about that. Like, so there is a feminist digital self-defense guide now. So what you can do to stop things like doxing and how you can prevent that. And I think that kind of increased awareness is really important. Because it's important for all of us, but I also think it's really important in terms of acknowledging that there are specific gendered challenges associated with life online, from sexual harassment to issues around privacy and, all of this stuff. So actually having these digital self-defense guides being set up and then also being specifically targeted for having a kind of feminist perspective, I think is a really interesting step forward.
I think this harks
just
back
to caution that just because there's information about you doesn't mean anybody cares about you at all. So to not fall into the trap of thinking, they have my data, so I must be important. It's like, no, you're not important, I'm not important. No, none of us are important. There might be a tiny handful of people that are going to be considered important for some reason or other. But the other thing to caution is that just because masses and masses and masses of data have been collected doesn't mean anyone can actually produce any reliable knowledge out of it yet, or possibly ever. Because in fact, mostly that data is going to generate more data. So there's a kind of fog of data is a 21st century condition where it kind of starts to accumulate. I don't know if it accumulates exponentially, but it certainly seems to accelerate the rate at which it gathers. And the difficulty of finding patterns in it that are not just happenstance then starts to become a real set of problems. And in molecular red, I looked at climate science quite carefully. And that's a science where people have had to think about the big data that they have and how incredibly unreliable it is. And a lot of climate science is in finding ways to deal with unreliable data. Now, the thing is, in a lot of other applications of big data, that step hasn't even happened. And people are just directly trying to use globs of it and find things in it. So also to be a little careful that just because you've got data doesn't mean you can build reliable knowledge on it. There's a whole set of other steps, that one would have to attempt to debug that.
But the bad news is that having, unreliable conclusions drawn from it is much more likely and much more terrifying, and I mean, it's bound to happen, It's interesting also, again, to tie it back to one of the presentations to several, actually, of the last days, that the problem of the body and of incorporation that was mentioned with the lexicon that Karen and Linda and others presented keeps coming back. The problem of the incorporation as simultaneously having a body but also losing a body, that body being deconstructed or reconstructed on a different level, meaning on a data level or all sorts of other representational levels, but also of potentially new bodies being formed and being, basically concocted out of pre-existing body parts or of body parts which haven't even been invented yet. And I think this is also one of the other reasons why this meme of robotics keeps coming back as like the proxy body of the new body politic which hasn't been invented yet, right? It could be a prosthetics for the incorporation, that has not happened yet, the incorporation of the new body politic. I was also thinking in relation to porn and and the issue of corporation or incorporation, that actually this kind of imagery has I completely lost it from my view, because I was much more fascinated with the shininess of the new corporate aesthetics, right? In my mind, this kind of corporate visuality has completely replaced, in terms of a preoccupation, any sort of engagement with a representation of, let's say, the naked human body. I think the visual representation of the corporation has come to replace it in a certain way. It's also interesting. And one of the ways, in which bodies are fragmented, deconfigured, disfigured also. I mean, physically disfigured, but also reconfigured.
I think it's interesting that representations of data centers in cyberspace, which is a slight trope I've fallen into, but and something I tried to tackle within the video I showed, which was you do have hints at people being in the space, like cabinets are open and closed, and there's no continuity within that video. But humans are always forgotten in that space, and that server maintenance on all these servers is required, that the internet is a maintained body. And I guess that's the thing, those representations are always missing, and there's always a deliberate sort of, I guess, disconnect from the physicality where it's made into this sort of cloud-like structure. And that sort of is, again, I guess, something that we've traveled from in terms of relationships with how we would engage and travel through the internet. Like surfing was very present. All the images from the early internet had bodies. I mean, in terms of like, you would have like a figure surfing the internet. Copies of Wired magazine will always have some sort of representation of a physical person. Yeah. And I think that's been lost. I mean, I think it's now this, again, I think it's interesting to talk about the cloud and then think about transparency as well. We now think about the cloud and we think about transparency as sort of similar things in terms of the way data circulates, but the human isn't in that sphere at all.
But I think the now quite successful attempt to make cloud the word we use isn't just advertising, it's theological. It's to get us to think that there's a kind of spiritual hierarchy, and that control of the cloud is the thing that is, if you like, a peak term beyond which we can't question. And that I find kind of just ideologically challenging how you would unpick that, given that in reality, as you say, it's a whole bunch of servers that consume massive amounts of energy, a lot of them need to be near water to be cool and so on. So that's never discussed, or the fact that it's workers who have to maintain it. It's a cloud. How can you question a cloud?
Well,
Sorry, go on.
Oh no, there's an Arthur C. Clarke quote about technology that it becomes magic. And I think that's sort of been self-fulfilled by the tech industry, that by adding that element of the cloud, it becomes magic, it becomes unexplainable. I think that's very a deliberate strategy in some ways.
Yeah, I mean, just on that point, I think there is a kind of like weird Neoplatonism going on, which is tied up with this question of the body. I mean, if you look at some of the feminist work on the history of philosophy, so Elizabeth Spellman talking about somatophobia, so the fear of the somatic fear of the body. In a sense, it's always been the case that the body has been denigrated in relation to the mind, and think about all of those philosophical dualisms. And I think this kind of fantasy, like the cloud fantasy, the immaterial discussions, I just like going back to this incredibly old-fashioned thing, and in that sense, it's Neoplatonic precisely because, in a sense, the body is just this kind of like lesser, vulgar vessel. Through which, all life is a process of recollection, or we could say knowledge gathering, in your sense, different types of knowledge, and maybe from different perspectives, different worker perspectives. But in a sense, it's the body itself is kind of secondary, and it's interesting how that might go along with a kind of fetish for the body, not just the visual image, the digital image of the body, but a kind of anxiety, again, I'm talking about anxiety obsessively, about the body, and how, we can't actually synthesize the two. There's an absolute disjunction between the way we think about, life online or speculative or anxious thought and our physicality, which I think somatophobia then becomes this really useful term, how is this fear of the body being regenerated for a digital age, I guess?
And by the way, this is why I've never used the term the immaterial. I've never talked about cognitive labour. I've never talked about the general intellect. This was all a huge mistake. So I just want to be on record, like that conceptual architecture was a huge mistake for precisely that reason, because it's part of the same discourse.
Yeah, but I mean, whilst we're talking about sort of the removal of bodies here, there is another discussion about the insertion of bodies into those spaces, or rather the insertion of the idea of bodies, and particularly through the insistence upon ideas of embodiment that comes up with the kind of gendering of technologies. So, I mean, you've heard me go on about this before. Like, the fact that, we've decided that our digital assistants are going to be women. So Siri and Cortana, who are very obviously gendered in the marketing materials that are associated with them, they are she's. And this kind of appearance of virtual service work as being done by gendered avatars. So very often you'll find that there are images of women as bots. So, you can be a bot, but you can't be genderless, you still have to be female. And then that kind of harks back to the stuff about the way the ENIAC computer was represented. So that was famously coded by women, but all the images for the ENIAC have women in it, sort of standing there tending to the machines. But apparently they're models rather than the actual coders. So they just got in, some decorative females to stand there and display the product, like they're on the Price is Right or something. So I think there is both this removal of kind of actual, bodies with viscera and kind of problems and issues, and being replaced by these these one-dimensional gendered avatars who are in some ways the perfect virtual service workers, the perfect service workers, because they don't have any of the problems associated with women. Like in One-Dimensional Woman, this is something that you talk about, like the woman as being like the ideal kind of service worker because she's young and she's chipper and she turns up and she does it. But now actually you've removed the possibility of pregnancy or illness or or getting tired or failure by replacing them with these avatars.
I would say in terms of the sort of split, one of the other main splits that relates to this is that, you can be a voice without a body or a body without a voice, and that's heavily gendered. I mean, think about the dominance of the female-sounding recorded voice, in transport hubs and shopping machines and, telesales. Of course, it's absolutely gendered. It's not some machinic, neutral future voice. It completely ties into this long history of secretaries and personal assistants. And I think I've written about this as a kind of cover story. The female-sounding voice is a cover story for the real violence and the real way in which the everyday is a kind of emergency and a kind of violence. And it's a voice that's supposed to softly coerce you into doing the right thing and rushing home and not causing trouble. And I think it's absolutely even clearer now that you can be a voice without a body or a visual body but without a voice, and this is a problem again. Everything's a problem.
No, but I mean, one could also reverse this idea and try to speculate about the idea that basically there is also an anxiety about accepting that as a human being, you're not limited to your body, right? The body is not the container of your subjectivity, but you're always basically outside of your body. You're always, messed up and mixed up with other individualities, within social relations, right? And I think this is maybe one of the anxieties also towards networked relations, the loss of control, the fear of the collectivity and of the uncontrollable processes happening in there, the merging, of different desires and so on. So in a way, this could also be reversed.
Yeah, it has to be acknowledged that both embodiment and sociality aren't always fun. Like, it isn't always pleasant to be, having to spend 5 hours on the fucking plane coming here. It's like, crushed into the seat. How I wish I could not be a body on this freaking aircraft. We've all had that sort of experience. Or having to go see the in-laws for the annual holiday get-together where you talk to people you don't like, but they're in-laws.
You're going to make an in-laws joke.
No. I wasn't going to go there. And I quite like mine in small doses.
I think this might be being recorded as well, so heads up.
Yeah. Hi, Cliffords. Love you all.
To be in control of.
But I'm just looking for examples that are likely to be in common experience, that embodiment and sociology, they're not always things that are, on the side of the good, whereas being outside of those things is on the side of the bad. There's kind of reasons we like our sociality to be mediated, and even our relations to family and things to be mediated sometimes.
Being on Skype as opposed to being
actually going there. It's like sometimes that works.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
But I'm sure there are more questions or comments from the audience. Yes, there is a question over here.
Well, it's really just a comment, but just to add to this whole question about embodiment, it was something I was going to say during Helen's talk, but we ran out of time. But I just kept thinking about the Klaus Taverleit male fantasies and the sort of fantasies of the Freikorps officers in Nazi Germany, and their sort of hostility to female bodies as a sort of threat to this idea of a very strong, defined body. And that seems to be feeding into this whole question about incorporation and sort of fear of slime and body parts and fantasies of flooding and so on.
I mean, it may be the case that the most comfortably embodied are like big tough white guys, and everybody else has to negotiate around them as they take up the space. I often feel I'm partly implicated in that and also partly not. But then the other side of that is the fragmentation, not just between the voice and the image, but the micro fragmentation of all those things then again as well, that the feminine, in a very traditional sense, is now just distributed everywhere on the surface of everything in a way that excludes those images or sounds ever being imagined as part of whole women or of whole communities at all. So the image or voice that's trying to sell you a cell phone or is going to answer your query on it and so on, or the ad on the side of the bus. So the strange thing is the fragmenting and dispersal of the feminine at the same time as it kind of denies the actual agency that might then be the mirage of.
Yeah, because it's femininity as itself a technology, right? So
exactly.
This is where in persuasive robotics and so on, you have gendered robots, because there's the assumption that gendered behavioural traits will make people do things more efficiently. Like, if you have a female gendered care bot, somehow it will play into something that will make you think, okay, I'm more likely to do what this says. So this dispersal of femininity means it's then itself a technical tool. But again, we have to be really careful because it's not a technical tool that's equally available to everybody in every situation. There's a lot to be negotiated around what it means to be feminised, for labour to be feminised, and what all of the issues kind of that brings with it to label it in that way. There has to be quite a delicate dance done around it. And in terms of slime and gross stuff, I guess, but it sort of crops up in this new form of this generalised porn, because it is all about affect. So it's about having a paroxysm of some kind. Whether that is a sort of orgasmic paroxysm, or you are gagging because you feel nauseated, or it's a shudder of horror, there's some kind of spasmic affective reaction that happens. And that's what this more exploded notion of porn is interested in. So there will be slime, there will be gross stuff, but you're not meant to see it and accept it as part of being human. You're supposed to have that process of objection where you sort of push it away so that you're separated from it, but you want to look at it because you want to be grossed out, and there's a whole clustering of stuff that happens there. And I should also note, in terms of the point that was being made about incorporation and the corporate sort of landscape, so the corporate online landscape, porn is one of the last bastions where you really, if you're looking for it for free, you have to go through some of the worst designed interfaces ever. You have to put up with 1,000 pop-ups that come out all the time. You try to close one, another one opens, the links are in the wrong place. There are flashing banner ads that are really those those horrible old websites. There's this sort of hangover in there, but then you get this very corporate side of things in sort of production houses like Vivid, for example, has a very slick aesthetic where everything looks a bit sort of shiny. But it's when you're looking for it for free, you kind of get punished by this really jarring aesthetic and constant waiting and frustration, which then actually gets built into one's sort of experience of porn. If you're looking at porn for free, you expect an element of irritation with your arousal, and it sort of all gets wrapped up. together.
Okay. I'm sure there are more comments. Yes, Linda, and then there's one comment here and one comment there. Thank you.
I guess, because there's a few things. I mean, the one thing is that for me it's really jarring to hear someone talk about embodiment as if that is an abstraction that doesn't relate to kind of real bodies, or as if you can talk about it outside of gender, especially as a man. So I think that that is a thing that I would just kind of flag, that is. But maybe what is interesting, I'm just thinking about like Sarah Ahmed's writing, is to think about orientations. And maybe that's something that is quite useful in thinking about affect and the digital and kind of... So one of the things talked about there is that, you know, as a kind of ideal body, the world is oriented towards you. It kind of fits, you fit into that world. And that's true digitally, I think, as well as in any other kind of world, which is a bit what you were saying about kind of being the ideal body. But maybe that idea of orientation, kind of, if you add it to incorporation to the other things we've talked about, is kind of an interesting way to think about embodiment or kind of bodies. So that was just to kind of throw that in as an idea, maybe.
Yeah, as well as suggesting I can pass as a straight white guy, but I don't feel, really all of those things. So I can see how, this is a really comfortable embodiment, but sometimes also not. And so just from a personal point of view, then yes, that then opens up the question of gender, of ability, of race, as ways different forms of embodiment are, I should say, quite separate and different experiences about which I can't speak because they're not mine.
Just as an additional comment, I mean, if you're going to talk about the body politic, it's always going to be abstracted, right? Or at least beyond an individual, not beyond, different, than an individual body. So, but maybe this is one of the complications that's inherent in the, different meanings of this word, right? But they do exist, and I think it's almost impossible to just confine the meaning to one of the usages. Okay, there was a comment here.
Can you hold on for 2 seconds for the mic, sorry.
I was just thinking about the comment about Tevelite and the association of women, femininity with the abject, with the sort of goos of the world. And that in this model in which we might speculate that there is a dispersed femininity, which has its negative cast, then I wondered then what you might think about the way that perhaps the abject is uncoupling from our notions of the feminine, which would then sort of feed into what you were saying about different modes of pornishness.
Just a really quick thing about the Tableite. It's important in the Tableite that he makes a very clear distinction between two types of women specifically, which is the red women and the white women. And white women are sisters, usually of other men in the Freikorps, and they're safe women in the sense that they're like nurses, they're teachers, they're not this dangerous flood type woman, and then the red woman in all sense, politically, menstrually, and so on, is the dangerous woman. So there's a really important distinction, because how else do the SS reproduce? I mean, it's not like they don't get married, right? There is, of course, the male body is the hard body, but they have a relation to reproduction, but it has to be with the supposed white women, right? So I think it's kind of complicated about what those bodies are, and those bodies are kind of sexless, caring bodies. They're like pre-maternal bodies. Anyway, that was just on the table.
Yeah, but then that kind of relates to the suggestion there that this dispersed femininity has a negative valence. It may do, but it also doesn't necessarily. Actually, it is often associated with those kind of characteristics that, if it being kind of caring, that's why you program your physiotherapy bot that has to persuade you to do things you don't really want to do. Program it with a female voice so that it's then associated with femininity as this way of making things happen. And, it is problematic to suggest that they're two... Well, it's problematizing to think about femininity outside of embodiment, because the two are kind of very much rolled in together, but it becomes something that has to be negotiated, because very obviously it's using gender traits there for particular effects, but just without women. So femininity without feminine, to some extent, in a weird way.
There was a question back there.
Hi, I was just wondering if maybe the idea of bot ethics is something that would need to be discussed at some point. So this talk of gendered avatars and bots and their kind of particular roles, and it's something I've thought about in terms of artists and corporations working with bots in various ways, or is that kind of beyond the point when what we should be worrying about is the humans who often get exploited, as many of these presentations have touched on, in digital labour and potentially in artistic production as well.
But can you elaborate? What would you mean by a bot ethics?
Well, I guess I was just thinking about, is it, maybe this is a bit kind of sci-fi territory, but would it be possible to exploit bots, and would there be some kind of future point where we'd almost have to be thinking in terms of bot rights, or almost kind of jurisdiction on behalf of bots, or is that just a kind of ridiculous thing when actually the bots are just standing in for these existing power structures, which then get put through into the types of avatars, or the types of voices, or the types of bots that we tend to see. Does that make sense?
There's a theme in Platonov which has got to do with whether you can be comrades with machines or not. Mm-hmm. And it's connected in him with love of machines, and it's never very sexual, and I think it's even it doesn't support a Freudian reading. It's more to do with care, and he's someone who worked on railways at a time when the railways were falling apart. So it's all about a love of the machine and a respect for it, and it's a sort of machine age sensibility that in some ways we might have lost a little bit. We sort of black box the computer and think of it as something separate, and don't think of a sort of ethic of care of it. And it's not to anthropomorphise it, but to think that care for materials might not be an invalid thing to try to revive in a way. I've seen the way like my kids treat the computers, and it kind of horrifies me. It's like come on, like treat that thing with respect. Like someone made that. It's an object of labour, which would then be to think the dare I say, dignity of labour extending to the things that labour makes. That all of those things are worthy of some sort of care. In a world where we just throw it all away, including the labour. So there would be ways, I think, to unpack all this, starting from the very point of view you're suggesting, before you even get to science fiction questions of the bot as cognitive and so on.
Isn't there like a quite violent relationship with computer technology? Even the term hacker is quite a violent term. And that kind of, the idea of disruption is also violent. So all these things sort of have a sort of inherent disrespect for the hardware.
No, I don't think that's necessarily the case. I mean, even just as a blow, like a good hack falls along the line of the muscle so that you don't blunt your own blade. There's a way you think about this also as an ethics of care. This won't keep vegetarians happy in the audience, but if you extend ethic of care to meat, then this is how you should care for it. And hacking I never thought of as breaking, but of finding affordances. What will the thing do up to the point of breaking it? So I find it a little different to the sort of destructive relation.
Okay, there's another question.
Yeah, it ties in a little bit what you were just talking about black boxing and how, and I think the process of black boxing seems, it's kind of an essential part of engineering logic, which is how we create these technologies, whether that is hardware or software. And it feels to me that black boxing is kind of crucial in separating us, not just from the object. We don't have to understand how it works anymore in order to use it, even engineers, like no one understands a whole airplane. But it also separates us from, for example, the very people that are digging the materials out of the ground somewhere that are necessary to make this computer, or for whoever else is kind of on the other side of that. And so I guess I'm wondering if, when we talk about technology, whether we're not talking too much about this kind of neutral tool that we can use however we want, Whereas if we were to dig in to the processes that are necessary to make these technologies, that actually some of these processes perhaps are inherently flawed because they kind of create this distance, which is an ethical distance in some way. So I guess the question would be, could you elaborate on sort of kind of the digging into these processes that are necessary to make technologies?
I mean, it's Bogdanov's whole problem in a way, which is that each specific kind of labour generates its own knowledge of what it is that it does. It also generates knowledge that might be applicable to other things, but how would one then organise the relation between different kinds of knowledge that's produced out of different kinds of labour? And he's explicitly saying the answer isn't a universal philosophy. The answer has to be a practice whereby one connects one thing to the other reciprocally. So can there be a commons of kinds of knowledge that accounts for the fact that in a division of labour, yes, you'll have to specialise, there'll be black boxes, I won't know how your bit works, you won't know how my bit works, but there might still be things we can learn from each other and produce the world on a collective basis. So that would be his whole problematic, which strikes me as very 21st century. You know, that's sort of where we are.
But, you know, to come back to the presentations made in this conference, I think in most of the examples of people using bots or minor AIs to basically illuminate processes, I think there are probably also artworks, but I think the striking fact is that they serve to illuminate these processes that are taking place by way of failure or extensive duration, or, you know, we have seen different models of how this works, but in most of these examples they were used as a sort of test figures, and this is why I am so eternally, I have a really positive relation to these creatures and a sort of eternal gratitude, you know, because they enable a form of testing which, at least in this territory, is non-lethal. I'm eternally grateful to stock photography, you know, and to all these avatars, because it means that a real human doesn't have to do it, no? The real human female doesn't have to speak these sentences. Some machine will do it on her behalf, no? So I have this very, very positive relationship, and I remember that Elena said yesterday it was about testing and military testing, right? She was describing this situation, what was it again, when 18-year-old Marines, well, US soldiers, were trained by way of computer simulation. They had to apologize to people into whose house they broke into, you know? And now they had to somehow be culturally, sensitive and try to make friends to them. And they were trying to simulate this by way of, you know, 3D environments. And she said, well, what do I think about it? Is it better to have someone train on this thing, yes or no? And when pressed, I would always say, in the worst case, yes, it's better, you know, to have this kind of training. And this is what bots and avatars and all these processes, I think they are essentially processes, provide for the moment. And I think, you know, in the future, probably your question, especially as these processes evolve, no, and become maybe more self-reflexive and autonomous, will become very, very important. But maybe it's not at this point now.
Yeah, and I think we just have to say kind of a couple of things about that. So, techno-feminism has dealt with this kind of quite well, because it really stresses that, yeah, we have to think about how technical infrastructures and specific technologies are designed. We have to think about who's doing the designing, how they are built. But as well as kind of agitating around that, we do need to think about repurposing and what we can do to kind of, okay, we've got certain things, what can be done with them, you know? And again, this is something that Judy mentioned on Friday about the fact that we can never dictate in advance how a technology will be used. So, you know, they tend to be, like the microwave, for example, was originally sold as a brown good alongside hi-fis, because it was supposed to be for like young bachelor men who would sort of like, and it was supposed to be like super high-tech and really like gadgety and, oh, check out my microwave. And then as more and more kind of women started using them and taking them up, they had to sort of rebrand the microwave as a family technology. So, you know, they couldn't dictate in advance how it would be used or imagine in advance how it would be used. And of course, that's going to be limited and constrained by certain things, and, you know, and a lack of in-depth technical knowledge about how specific technologies work will be one of them. But I think we can do both. We can think about the design and how things are built, and we can then think about, well, what can we do with what we've got here? How can we kind of widen the aperture for a better world based on the technologies we have now?
Okay, more questions? Yes. One, and then second, and then third. She was first.
Hi, I was just interested because you said something about like women not having to speak the words that certain like AIs or avatars speak. But I guess like what happens when there's like technologies like Siri that is actually a real woman's voice, that like they've recorded her saying every single syllable that you can say to make her be able to speak any word in the English language. So I guess what do you think about that when someone's voice is, I guess, like taken away from them and then used for purposes that they wouldn't necessarily agree with, and she didn't even know that this was going to be how, like she didn't know that her voice was going to be used in this way. So I guess,
she didn't?
No.
I see.
Like she found out through a friend.
That's not fair.
Okay.
Yeah. Because you know the male guy who is her equivalent, he got paid. He's an actor.
She was paid. She like did it 5 years ago before they did Siri, and then they she didn't know exactly what technology it was going to be used for, so she found out when it was released.
Yeah. That's unfair, right? I mean, if she would have agreed, then it would be a different story, I think.
I've got a really great story in this regard about the sale and ownership of the female-sounding voice. And it relates to the voice of the Tube, who's a woman called Emma Clark, who's a voice performer. So every time and it's still the voice. So yeah, it's pre-recorded, and then they use concatenation to like use different parts. And but basically, she did some parodies. Because her voice is so recognizable, she did some parodies of the Tube announcements.
Yeah.
And partly as a result that she was fired from being the voice of the Tube because she was deemed to have brought the London Underground into disrepute. And so there you are. This is what happens when your voice basically is does not belong to you anymore. So.
But is that not the case with all labour? Like none of our labour belongs to us anymore. It's just like an eerily present example that you're reminded that you.
Yeah, I guess it's a more intimate example in the sense that she, it's her, it's a much more like, she writes very well about it. Like she can't go into supermarkets when they have adverts playing because she doesn't want to hear her own voice selling herself cut-price meat.
Okay, there's two more comments.
Hey, I've been thinking about the earlier discussion about embodiment in terms of its relationship with Facebook and having a corporeal presence while being linked to a digital one, and that as like a site of exploitation by companies mining your data or what have you, and then like needing to use like a name on Facebook or committing to a gender. And I was just wondering if the panel has any thoughts on, because at least I see a lot of people using that as a new space for play. If I have to commit to something, I might as well have fun with it, or using these sort of formats as spaces for experimentation, and sort of maybe more of like a role play type environment. I was just wondering if you have any thoughts I want to bring this back to yesterday, Ashcan, and his talking about the inner morph as like its being of the Anthropocene being based on code, and I don't know, immateriality maybe is something which is comes from the Enlightenment, or is maybe not good for a lot of reasons because it's disenfranchising from our physical bodies, but at the same time, maybe it provides something else. I don't know.
Yes, play is a more enjoyable form of testing, I guess, right? But this is also what Eleanor again touched upon in her presentation yesterday, that these types of role play they are basically models for social prototyping, right? Models for testing or ways of testing different models of being together or not, even not being together, of relating. So definitely, I think this is a really important aspect.
But you could see it as the difference between the old culture industry and what I call the vulture industry, with the culture industry, they at least had to make the damn programs to entertain us. But you didn't get to make your own, but the space of free play was interpretation. Like what you made of it was what it could be. You could have a camp reading, for example. But in the vulture industry, you have to actually produce the entertainment for your friends. You have to gather all the stuff that they will find interesting, and you have to say witty things, and they have to say them back at you. So it's as if the vulture industry makes us do all the work of the spectacle ourselves, but they still collect the rent, right? So just as the culture industry collected the rent from our collective unconscious, so the vulture industry also collects the rent, but we have to do the labour as well. So it's kind of outsourcing, except it's outsourcing I'd call insourcing, in the sense that it's like the interior of the culture that's being kind of mined. And we have to do all the labour and it's unpaid, whereas before a small group of people got paid to do it. So that would be the transition within the industrial system towards something that's well and truly post-Fordist.
Yeah, I don't think there is any fun anywhere. I think there's only work and a kind of, I don't know, occasional, slightly less antagonistic relation to things. Maybe it's just me. But I think, but more seriously, perhaps, I think we don't yet know what fun is. And maybe that's like an important political question.
It's a Firestonian kind of question.
Yeah, maybe so.
If you're sort of like, okay, well, everything's kind of up for grabs, but I don't know.
Yeah, but Firestone's solution is a little bit like, pansexuality is also like sex with children, and I don't think that's very fun. I don't think sex is fun. So I mean, sex is like, whatever we mean by this now, it's not. It's just like, oh God.
Yeah, but I always think with Firestone, one of the things that gets really overlooked is that he's actually thinking about the right for people not to have to have sex as the most meaningful relationship in your life. So actually trying to decouple.
I know, but she does say that stuff about children.
She does, but I've also noticed that it's different in different editions. Like I think the women's press version is a lot less like kid sex, and so it's my favourite interpretation. But I think this idea of being free from sex rather than free to have as much of it as possible is also really kind of important and valuable and worth saying. Let's see if we can actually create new modes of intimacy that don't revolve around around sex, which comes with all this baggage that she finds really difficult to kind of negotiate our way out of.
There was one more question. Yes.
What do you think will be the next FOMO, as in what will this event be called next year?
We need the ICA staff to come in.
That's good, yeah. GHAA. Something, whatever, I can't do that. Letters.
But there will be one for sure. I mean, that much we know. Anxiety will not go away. It will just have a different name, I suppose.
I mean, a good hashtag is like a Hollywood movie. It takes as many people to make it, and it circulates for a while and sort of is a concatenator for the affect of a moment, But then no one will need it again until it's time to watch reruns, and then we'll go, FOMO, I remember, and they'll come back. But they're like Hollywood movies in that sense, and with as much, they're as hard to make.
Okay, more comments? Or more questions? Or maybe rather comments? Oh, I'm sure there are. Yes.
On the question of fun and whether we're having any yet, I was reminded of Zizek's "Du darfst," you must enjoy. The sort of imperative to have fun kind of takes away all the fun. Maybe that's where your comments, can be situated.
I don't think they can be situated.
And that's what I thought of when you were talking about FOMO at the start of this, where you were like, oh, you know, maybe we should just miss out. Like, maybe it should be fun of missing out, the enjoyment of not having to.
Well, Schumann Bazaar has JOMO, which is the joy of missing out. So.
Okay, so I think we managed to turn this around somehow. Yes, we're good.
Fear of missing in.
Okay, well, thanks a lot to everyone.
Thank you, Hito.
Thank you.